All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this great webinar with myself, Janelle Smith, registered dietitian, the consulting dietitian for the Celiac Disease Foundation. Today, we'll be covering most of the basics and ins and outs of the gluten-free diet. So for anyone who is just getting started with the diet, or anyone who has additional questions or hasn't been able to see an expert dietitian in celiac disease or the gluten-free diet, this is a really great webinar. I want to let you know that also the webinar will be recorded and will be available on celiac.org at celiac.org/webinars. So this might also be a nice thing to share with your family or friends who might have some difficulty understanding your needs or the diet. This would be a really great webinar to share with them. You're welcome to ask any questions in the individual or the group chat box, and I'll do my best to answer them. So let's get started. If the slides will work for me. Okay, so today we're going to cover these points in our webinar. First, I'm going to answer what is gluten. Then we're going to go over reading food labels and identifying sources of gluten in foods. Then preventing cross-contamination, which is an important part of the gluten-free diet that one might not immediately think of. I'm going to offer some advice for different lifestyle changes that may be important when living a gluten-free life, as well as cover some myths that are circulating, especially on the internet, which is both a blessing and a curse that there's so much information available about gluten and the gluten-free diet. But it can be definitely overwhelming to sort through and figure out what's reputable information and what is not. So first of all, let's talk about why is it so important to discuss the gluten-free diet? And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. But as you know, the gluten-free diet is currently the only effective treatment for celiac disease. In the cases where a gluten-free diet fails, there might be additional medications added, but there's no substitute for a gluten-free diet when it comes to celiac disease. It's literally the only, one of the only diseases that I know of whose only treatment is dietary. And what is so important about understanding the diet is that very small amounts of gluten being consumed, especially over long periods of time, will cause intestinal damage. Whether or not a person has symptoms does not necessarily signify if there is intestinal damage. So it's important to follow a gluten-free diet if you're diagnosed with celiac disease, or if your physician has said that it's really necessary for your health. And in terms of celiac disease, we know that not everyone has symptoms from ingesting gluten in the short term, but long term, there will be consequences to one's health. So what are some of the risks of not following a gluten-free diet if you are diagnosed with celiac disease? If you're having trouble hearing me, please raise your flag as well. I got one notification that we're having difficulty hearing. Okay. So what are the risks of not following a gluten-free diet? In terms of celiac disease, we know that the earlier someone is diagnosed, the lower their risk of developing additional autoimmune diseases. So this suggests that starting a gluten-free diet as soon as possible, once we know that the disease is activated, is the best thing for preventing additional complications. We know that Hashimoto's thyroiditis, multiple sclerosis, pretty much every autoimmune disease has a higher risk in celiac disease, and that starting a gluten-free diet can lower the risk of developing those additional disorders. It may not prevent it in everyone, but that's what the data is showing. Not following a gluten-free diet will lead to malabsorption. Whether or not someone has severe symptoms, malabsorption can cause vitamin and nutrient deficiencies. This can lead to other health problems, especially fatigue and even cosmetic changes like hair loss. Poor quality of life is very common in those before being diagnosed, and missed work days definitely and decreased productivity increase when someone is not following a gluten-free diet but suffering from celiac disease. There's some data showing that infertility might be increased in untreated celiac disease. Intestinal cancers and T-cell lymphoma are risks of not treating celiac disease. And the case of refractory celiac disease, it's not known if it's completely genetic, but usually refractory celiac disease occurs in elderly people who are thought to have been suffering long-term damage for most of their life. So this suggests that not following a gluten-free diet may cause the disease to become more severe. So when we're talking about adherence to a gluten-free diet, remember that having symptoms doesn't always mean you've eaten gluten. There's so many different kind of co-occurring disorders that occur in those with celiac disease, as well as a lot of reasons that people have symptoms. Likewise, having no symptoms doesn't always mean that you have good compliance. There are plenty of people who maybe never had bad symptoms to begin with, or initially had terrible symptoms before diagnosis, and from then on they don't have much of a reaction to small amounts of gluten eaten. So symptoms are not the best measure of compliance. Also keep in mind that research on the diet is always evolving, and it's certainly not complete. So when you hear clinicians, including myself, giving their best judgment, sometimes it's based on research, and sometimes there's just no research to fall back on. And so we're using our best judgment. Also, we do know that the level of sensitivity to gluten varies among individuals, even in those with celiac disease. We might think of gluten sensitivity as a spectrum as well. That doesn't mean that those with gluten sensitivity have less intense symptoms to gluten. Often they actually report the opposite. They report very intense symptoms from accidentally eating gluten. But it is thought that there are some individuals who can tolerate a certain level of gluten without having intestinal damage, and there are others who will have intestinal damage at ingesting even less gluten than that. Some of the symptoms that people report from ingesting gluten, usually through cross-contamination or accidentally ingesting it, often gastrointestinal symptoms come first within the first hour or so after eating gluten, but not everyone has these symptoms. So gastrointestinal symptoms might include bloating, nausea, vomiting even, diarrhea, and then longer term that could lead to constipation. Some people have completely neurological symptoms or just a feeling of unwellness. They may have tingling in their hands or feet. They may develop a migraine. Still others develop a rash. So the symptoms from ingesting gluten vary from individual to individual. Just because your symptoms don't look like somebody else's doesn't mean necessarily that you are good on your diet or you haven't been good on your diet. So let's answer the question, what is gluten? And this is highly debated on the internet among different groups of kind of nutrition and diet followers. In terms of celiac disease, gluten is the groups of proteins that are found in the grains wheat, barley, and rye. And it's not just one protein. There's actually many there's many different proteins that make up gluten. And in terms of food science, gluten is defined as this, the complex of gliadin and glutenin that creates a structure to baked goods like bread, muffins, cookies, that gives it its texture and crumb. But whether or not it's baked, all grains in wheat, barley, and rye have these proteins that, when digested and in our intestines, cause a reaction an immune reaction in our intestines. What gluten is not is the protein in other grains like corn or rice. You might see some information on the internet about corn gluten or glutinous rice. And in terms of celiac disease, we're not concerned about those proteins. Gluten is not glue. It's not always found in glue, even though it sounds like glue. It does act like glue frequently in baked goods, and that's where the name comes from. And it's not glucose. I sometimes get weird looks when I say I can't eat gluten, and people think I'm diabetic. I don't know if anyone else has encountered that. So let's go into different aspects of following the gluten-free diet. The first and I think most important part is reading food labels. Given that so many of us are eating, processed and packaged foods, sometimes even our produce has a nutrition label on it. So it's really important to be proficient at reading labels to make sure that you're not eating foods that contain gluten. Thankfully, recently the FDA solidified the definition of gluten-free on their labels, which includes, most foods, most packaged foods. So in terms of the gluten-free labeling that's in place now, gluten-free means the same as free of gluten or no gluten or without gluten. So all of these phrases mean gluten-free. In order for a product to label itself gluten-free, it must not contain wheat, barley, rye, or triticale. And it also can't contain ingredients derived from these grains unless the ingredient is processed to remove gluten. In essence, the final product can't contain more than 20 parts per million gluten, which is a certain measurement by weight of gluten particles. 20 parts per million would be in flour, the amount of wheat flour that would fit under your pinky fingernail. So it's a very small amount of flour, and gluten content can vary among foods. A food can be labeled gluten-free if it is naturally gluten-free. I don't know if any of you have seen gluten-free water or gluten-free milk. Foods that have always been naturally gluten-free can certainly be labeled gluten-free. And this doesn't mean actually that they have to, the producers of these foods need to test those products. So just because a label has a gluten-free, a food has a gluten-free label does not mean that it has been tested. And the FDA has said that any unavoidable presence of gluten through processing or manufacturing must be below 20 parts per million. So the final product can not contain more than 20 parts per million. Does this mean that there could be gluten in our gluten-free food? Yes, there could be very small amounts of gluten in our gluten-free food. And basically, this guideline was developed based on a body of research that showed that 20 parts per million was decided to be the safest level for the most amount of people. There are people with celiac disease who may not be able to tolerate that amount of gluten. So unfortunately for some people, they may need to avoid processed foods and products, but that's definitely a decision to be made with a skilled dietitian and physician to make sure that those foods are the source of ongoing gluten contamination. So the gluten-free label does not have any specific symbol or logo. So foods that have the words gluten-free in tiny print on the back of the label are just as gluten-free as those that have a huge circle, no gluten, some sort of graphic or logo on the front. It also doesn't require testing to verify that a product is gluten-free. Mostly it doesn't outline the tests that must be done. It doesn't outline how they should be done, but there are definitely industry standards for the best ways to test gluten-free products. And the FDA is regulating these foods via random inspections and also via product recalls from customer complaints. So the FDA will follow up on any complaints of an accidental allergen in a food. The FDA suggests that the definition of gluten-free apply to food service. But currently, local governments are the ones that have jurisdiction over food service establishments. So it's definitely not widely known that this definition should apply to food service. Um, and it also doesn't apply to the label no gluten-containing ingredients, which I've found a lot more products utilizing, which may signify that there could be contamination. So keep in mind that there are several gluten-free labels or symbols out there that signify that a third-party company has verified that the product is gluten-free. So this is not required of companies. They can have their own in-house or third-party testing, and they don't have to create a specific symbol to signify that it's gluten-free. But certain kind of organizations have created these certification programs just to ensure compliance and kind of be a watchdog for the products that they certify. And each of them usually has their own standards and protocols, but all of them fit within the FDA definition. Most of them are slightly more stringent, so their products may have to test to less than 10 parts per million or less than 5 parts per million, which is the lowest that a product can test based on currently available test equipment. And a recent study by the USDA, actually, of a survey of different kind of grain-based foods and gluten-free labeled foods, found that there was no significant difference in compliance between foods labeled gluten-free versus those certified gluten-free. So in general, it's not necessary to have a third-party verification. It certainly may offer more comfort for the consumer, but don't be afraid of the products that don't have a certification per se. All right, here's my 1, 2, 3 step recommendation for reading food labels. And it can be very confusing to sort through all of these ingredients that have food science names, and almost feels like you have to have a chemistry degree to understand ingredients. The first step that you're going to take when you're looking at a food label, see if it has a gluten-free label. Does it state gluten-free somewhere on the packaging? Nowadays, also in that recent USDA survey, they found that upwards of 95 to 98% of products were actually correctly labeled. So there was a small amount of products labeled gluten-free that erroneously had contained gluten, and I hope that that will continue to become less and less. But for the most part, products that are labeled gluten-free are doing so correctly. Whether or not it's labeled gluten-free, I always recommend looking or just reading at the ingredients label, but especially if it's not labeled gluten-free, you want to make sure that there's no allergen statement that it contains wheat. Allergen statements for food products have to include wheat. So by law, because it's such a common allergen, if a food contains wheat, it must say so somewhere in the ingredients area. It might say contains wheat, or it might say wheat in parentheses under the ingredients. Barley and rye are not included in this allergen warning, so you would only find them in the list of ingredients. You wouldn't see them in an allergen statement, unless I think some companies actually can choose to include the additional ingredients if they want. In terms of, so if a food contains wheat, we avoid it because that's obviously a gluten-containing grain. Then we need to go more in depth into the ingredients label, and these are the main ingredients that we find that most certainly contain gluten and therefore would not be gluten-free. We have malt, malt flavor, malt vinegar, malt extract, brewer's yeast, and oats. Oats in themselves are gluten-free, but if a product is not labeled gluten-free, there's a high chance that the oats are contaminated. And this is why I include them in this labeling guide. If the product is not labeled gluten-free, I also recommend that if it's a grain-based product, you consider choosing things that do not have a manufacturing warning. In a recent study, products that were naturally gluten-free but not labeled gluten-free were more likely to be contaminated if they were grain-based. So this applies often to things like cereals, chips, or granola bars. And a lot of those products did contain oats that were not labeled gluten-free. So I think we do need more research on this. In terms of the manufacturing warning, it's not a required warning, such as the allergen label. So manufacturers do not have to state what other foods are produced in that facility or on shared equipment. If a manufacturer does state so, they usually do mean that they want consumers to be aware. But if a product is not grain-based, there's a lot less chance that it will be contaminated just based on what other products are manufactured in the facility. These ingredients, however, are pretty much always gluten-free. So maltodextrin is one of the most common ones that is confusing for people. And I think that might be because it starts with the word malt. Notice, I'm going to go back to the other slide, that all of these ingredients are two different words. Malt is separate. It's not a combined word. So if malt is on its own, it contains gluten. If it's a combined word like maltodextrin or maltose, farther down this list, which are both sugars, they're so highly processed that even if they came from wheat, they wouldn't contain any gluten, and they're considered gluten-free. Another one that's commonly avoided is food starch. Luckily, food starch, if it comes from wheat, the product will have to say contains wheat because of allergen labeling. There's a teeny tiny small chance that it could come from barley or rye, but in the United States, this just does not happen. Food starch is almost always from corn or tapioca. So food starch is almost always a safe ingredient, as is hydrolyzed vegetable protein. If it comes from wheat, it will need to declare wheat in the ingredients list, and therefore you will see the word wheat, and you'll know that it's not gluten-free. Artificial flavors are so processed that they do not contain gluten. I mentioned maltose. Dextrose and dextrin, as long as it doesn't say contains wheat, should be safe. And all vinegar except for malt vinegar. All vinegar, even if it comes from a grain, is distilled, and therefore the gluten is not on the final product. Same with pure vanilla extract or flavor. Extract is distilled. Just to reiterate, these ingredients are never gluten-free. So we have wheat, barley, and rye. Brewer's yeast. Brewer's yeast is the product of a brew made with hops or some flour-containing ingredient or some grain-based ingredient. So it will contain gluten. And then malt vinegar, malt extract, and malt flavor. Similarly, oats that are not labeled gluten-free in the final product are likely contaminated. These are other names for wheat. And in terms of food labels, you'll always see the warning contains wheat, or you'll see wheat in parentheses. So don't worry yourself with memorizing all these different names for wheat. The times that you want to look out for them is especially at restaurants, because you might not be familiar with which grains are gluten containing. Now we have a few kind of tricky ingredients that don't have enough research to really say that they're for sure safe, but there's probably a very low risk of gluten content. But for those who are more sensitive or more concerned, I would always recommend contacting manufacturers and finding out if these ingredients are gluten-free. Natural flavors may come from barley, and yeast extract may be an extract basically of brewer's yeast and might contain residual gluten. So those in two ingredients, it's important to check if they're gluten-free or not. Now, if the total product is labeled gluten-free, then I would trust that personally. There could be a small chance, but if the manufacturer states that the product is gluten-free, hopefully those ingredients are gluten-free. Wheat and barley grass. By themselves, the grass does not contain gluten, but there's definitely a high risk of cross-contamination. So I recommend to clients that they only consume these if the product is certified, state it is gluten-free. Then we have some USDA regulated foods that don't fall under our FDA labeling law. I'm going to skip ahead really quick. USDA foods still list ingredients. These are foods that are more like agriculture and livestock. So we have meat, seafood, produce, eggs, and liquid eggs as well. So these foods do not have to have the same label as FDA foods, and they don't have to declare their allergens. But the good news is that 90% of them do. So for the most part, they're in line with FDA foods. If you do see these ingredients on USDA foods, such as on the back of your meat package, maybe you have some seasoned meat in the grocery store that you've purchased, definitely look, and I would be wary of the ingredients food starch, dextrose, and dextrin. Because these could contain gluten, and the manufacturer does not have to declare if they contain wheat. Similarly, medications could potentially contain ingredients from gluten, and they currently do not have to declare allergens or gluten content. So check medications for those same ingredients, especially food starch. In medications, I find it's called gelatinized starch often, as well as dextrose and dextrin. If you do find these ingredients, it's a good idea to contact the manufacturer to ask if it is gluten-free, and hopefully with enough of our questions, everyone will be labeling their ingredients in the future. All right. Next, we have alcohol, which alcohol, regulated by the Tobacco and Trade Bureau, does not have to list ingredients or allergens. So alcohol can definitely be confusing. In this chart, I'm showing that the TTB regulates alcohol that has an alcohol content of more than 7%. And contains malted hops and barley. However, there's some alcohol that's regulated by the FDA, and it's usually those that only contain malted barley without hops. So a lot of your malted beverages that are not necessarily beers might be regulated by the FDA, and the alcohol content is lower, less than 7%. So you do want to check the ingredients labels of your alcohol. If there's an ingredients label, it's probably regulated by the FDA, and you can trust that the ingredients are being disclosed. If it doesn't have an ingredients label, you may need to contact the manufacturer. In terms of alcohol that's naturally gluten-free, all distilled liquor, whether or not it comes from a grain, is gluten-free and does not contain the protein gluten. But malted beverages that have not been distilled are not gluten-free. So examples of malted beverages not gluten-free would be certainly beer that's not gluten-free beer. And then things like there's some hard lemonades or hard ciders that have hop barley in them or even some like margarita products I've found that have malt in them. So again, you want to look for the word malt. And definitely if you think you have a reaction from alcohol, do note that it's alcohol, and alcohol can be irritating to the system. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact the manufacturer. Okay, so aside from reading labels, then we have the task of preventing cross contact. So whether we are living in a home in which other people are eating gluten, or we're encountering, all of us dine out in other people's homes, have dinner parties, go to restaurants and weddings, it's important to prevent cross contact with gluten in these situations because, like I said, the amount of gluten that can cause intestinal damage is very, very small. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of research studies on preventing cross contact, except for allergens in general. So these are some general recommendations for preventing cross contact. Definitely use a separate toaster and toaster oven. There's also toaster bags that can be purchased, or you can wrap your toasted item in foil to prevent the surface of it from coming in contact with crumbs. But toasters are so difficult to clean, and the heat does not destroy the gluten altogether. Colanders and strainers are important not to share because they have such tiny holes that may be difficult to clean. And also the starch can be left over on the strainers as well. Fryers are important not to share. So French fries should not, that are naturally gluten-free should not be cooked in the same oil as chicken fingers that are breaded. Bread makers and baking utensils might be difficult to clean. You definitely could clean it well enough, but I would definitely always ask how thoroughly something has been cleaned. And if you're using something on a regular basis, it's just a good idea to have a separate set for gluten-free items. Cutting boards are another example of preventing cross contact. A lot of times the grooves that build up in them are difficult to clean, and so I always recommend having a separate cutting board for gluten-free items. Condiments are definitely a source of cross contact. So at home, you might label different condiment jars gluten-free to remind your family members or roommates from using them. You might just switch to squeeze bottles so that nobody can dip their knife in the condiment jar, and that solves a lot of problems. Or you can institute a no double dipping policy. So you have to clean your knife before putting it back into the container. In terms of baking, I get this question a lot. Is it okay to cook or bake in a kitchen where gluten-containing items are being cooked? Baking is the more risky situation. In terms of cooking, we should always use separate utensils and make sure that surfaces are clean and pots and pans are thoroughly cleaned, but they usually can be shared. Baking is more tricky because flour can stay airborne for 12 to 24 hours. So it's important to protect your gluten-free items from regular flour, especially in places like a shared bakery. It's important to ask what steps they take to prevent cross-contamination. Here's some lifestyle tips that I've learned along the way. Often easiest to choose restaurants with a designated gluten-free menu. Thankfully, there are a lot more restaurants that are doing their research and looking into the ingredients. Again, the gluten-free label does not necessarily mean the same thing to restaurants that it does on food products. So I still always ask questions, but it can help if we're all starting on the same page. So when asking questions, I recommend to speak with the chef or manager rather than cashier or waiter. Typically, they know more, they're more willing to be honest and say that they don't know the answer to a question. I recommend asking questions such as, does it contain flour? Sort of an obvious one, but if you ask if it's gluten-free, not everyone will know what gluten means. Make sure it doesn't contain any soy sauce or malt vinegar. Those are more common in things like marinades for meats, salad dressings, some sauces. So flour, soy sauce, malt vinegar are some big ones. Stay away from baked goods. Be careful about soups or things with sauces. Those are the more risky items where you'll have to go more in depth to determine the ingredients. Ask them, especially if they have a gluten-free menu, how do you prevent cross-contact with other restaurant items? You want to make sure that the restaurant has thought of it and has a procedure in place that will prevent cross-contact. For example, pizzerias are very questionable. If they're not prepared on a separate surface or on their own pan, they could be contaminated for sure. Be careful also of shared fryers, shared pasta water, cutting boards, toasters if a restaurant offers gluten-free toast or sandwiches. Always ask if they can use new utensils, new pans, new cutting board, and change their gloves. So it can definitely be some work to eat out, and I recommend that if you find a place that does it well, that you really support them and give them the feedback and let them know how appreciated that is. And if you're ever unsure if you're going to find something safe or something that you're going to enjoy, I recommend eating before you go out so you can still enjoy time spent with other people, and not being starving when you're making the decision if it's gluten-free or not can definitely you can definitely avoid being hangry or being incredibly frustrated with the wait staff. Here's some different kind of saves that I've found. If you're not sure if something's gluten-free, if you can't find some place with a gluten-free menu, here's some really good options. So at a restaurant, maybe a place that doesn't speak great English, or you're having a hard time communicating, or you just don't want to bother to go through the rigmarole, you could stick with something simple like meat or seafood or tofu. Make sure it's not marinated. A baked potato is a really good source of carbohydrate and energy. Things like butter and sour cream and vegetables are naturally gluten-free. Make sure that when you order eggs, that they don't contain any pancake batter or thickener. If you are worried about this, you can always just order your eggs over easy. And in terms of salads, you can always add beans for a source of carbohydrate, naturally gluten-free, and use oil and vinegar for your dressing. Thankfully, a lot of caterers are now doing better at preparing gluten-free food, but always talk to the host or the caterer ahead of time before you arrive. Otherwise, I recommend bringing a backup meal with you, bringing a dish to share if it's, can be potluck style, to make sure that you have something you enjoy. Let's say you're at a friend or acquaintance house. Things like fruit, nuts, cheese, even popcorn. A lot of microwave popcorn is gluten-free. And a lot of ice cream is gluten-free if it doesn't have any cookie flavors. If it's one of your good friends, you might actually just ask to keep some frozen food in their freezer so that you always have something on hand. Then if we're on the road and it's difficult to find a gluten-free restaurant, I recommend things like gas stations that have hard-boiled eggs, cheese sticks, fruit, nuts, and a lot of potato chips are naturally gluten-free. Just be sure to read the label, the ingredients label. In a rush, I always keep some gluten-free bars and nuts in my glove compartment and in my purse because I have just been caught stranded too many times. Or a latte, maybe a soy latte if you're lactose intolerant, that has some sort of fat in it, can be very filling. And finally, we have some different myths that I wanted to dispel, which have very to no evidence that they could contain gluten. And I want people to just not need to worry about these. So blue cheese, a lot of times the mold for blue cheese is grown on bread. That's a typical way of making a French style blue cheese. There's been a little bit of research done actually in Canada that shows that the final cheese product is completely gluten-free, even though if the mold was grown on bread. In terms of tea bags and wine barrels, the sealants either do not contain gluten or not enough would leach out into the final product to cause a reaction. And the final product would be gluten-free. I remember when I was first diagnosed about 7 years ago, I was told never to lick a stamp or an envelope because the glue probably contained gluten. And actually, this is probably a huge myth, though I can't guarantee with 100% certainty that no glue contains gluten. It's not very common that glue would contain wheat starch anymore. And gluten, for those with celiac disease, does not cross-react with other grains or coffee or the thyroid. So if you find information about cross-reactivity, I'm very suspicious of it, and there's really no research to back up that claim. In terms of makeup and skincare products, unfortunately, we have almost no research to tell us that these products basically are either completely safe or completely not safe. So my best guess for this situation is that if a product is making you sick or causing a reaction, stop using it. It may or may not be from gluten in it. But they're basically makeup and skincare products cannot be absorbed through the skin and cannot cause the intestinal damage that is demonstrated by eating gluten. So we definitely need more research to show why some people react to gluten in these products, but you don't need to worry about them unless you're ingesting them or unless you're having a negative reaction. Okay, so for those who are new to celiac disease or just looking to improve kind of their routine, we have a really great 7-day meal plan up on the website. It's at celiac.org/meal plan. I will put that up. So here you can find a whole week long of different meal and snack ideas that are super balanced, designed by a registered dietitian, and a lot of them are naturally gluten-free. So definitely check out our 7-day meal plan. All right, everyone, I have a quiz for you that you can do for yourself that's based on a research study which evaluates how well people are following a gluten-free diet. So here's the first question. How much gluten do you eat voluntarily? Meaning not accidentally, but on purpose. So if you never eat gluten voluntarily, like in the last year, give yourself 1 point. If you take just a taste or a normal portion, you don't get any points for this question. The next question, when you eat out, do you tell the person who's cooking about your needs? If you do this almost all the time, you get a point. If you don't get a point. And finally, do you check the labels of packaged foods? If you answered yes, get 1 point. No, no points. All right, so let's see how you scored. If you have 0 or 1 points, research has shown that you probably have a higher risk of having intestinal damage or positive antibodies. A score of 2 points shows a slight risk or medium risk, and 3 points, individuals who follow all 3 of those questions have a low risk of having continued intestinal damage, and they usually have negative antibodies upon follow-up. So go ahead and take those results as you will and potentially incorporate the suggestions from today's webinar into your lifestyle. So like I said, this webinar will be available online tomorrow at celiac.org/webinars, and you can always reach me to ask me a question at celiac.org/ask. And I'll hang around for a few minutes to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much. All right, it doesn't look like there's any questions. If you need to ask a question, you can contact me at celiac.org/ask. And until next time, you'll have a wonderful evening.